On November 19th, 1863, in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, 4.5 months after the Union Army's bloody and decisive victory on that very site, Edward Everett, a former U.S. Senator and Secretary of State, delivered a 2-hour speech on the significance of the recent battle as part of the dedication of a cemetery for the soldiers killed in those fields. Though Everett was scheduled as the day's main event, he would not be remembered as such. The next invited speaker, President Abraham Lincoln, spoke just 272 words over the course of 2 to 3 minutes, but his address still lives on as perhaps the most significant speech in American history. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. As Everett would later write to Lincoln, I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes. Lincoln's speech did not mention Gettysburg, nor slavery, nor the Union itself. It doesn't mention the Emancipation Proclamation. None of the major political issues of the day were directly addressed. People invested in the question of emancipation were forced to interpret the hidden intent of Lincoln's phrasing. But in his few, carefully chosen words, Lincoln clarified the cause for which Union soldiers had fought and died. They had come to this battlefield in order to sustain a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Though equality was the central element of the Declaration of Independence, it was not mentioned in the Constitution at all. One of Lincoln's accomplishments was to emphasize equality as a fundamental, if unspoken, principle of the U.S. Constitution. The Civil War could no longer be understood as a struggle for the restoration of the Union, but as a battle for human equality. The words and phrases of the speech carried a spiritual charge. Lincoln deliberately modeled his rhetoric to match the tones of the King James Bible. One historian even suggests that divine help told Lincoln how to communicate to the people assembling at Gettysburg. A New York Times article published the following day indicates that the address was interrupted 5 times by applause, but the historian Shelby Foote asserts that, quote, the applause was delayed, then scattered and barely polite. The crowd was taken aback by the brevity of Lincoln's remarks, especially coming after Everett's epic-length address. There is plenty of conflicting evidence about this pivotal moment in American history. Some say that Lincoln wrote his remarks on a scrap of paper while taking the train to Gettysburg, and some say that Lincoln spoke his words from memory. Only one known and confirmed photograph of Lincoln at Gettysburg exists. Though no one could mistake the meaning of the new birth of freedom to which Lincoln alluded, the address remained silent about the fate of African Americans in the newly unified nation. The great task mentioned by Lincoln was not emancipation, but the preservation of self-government, and he did not say whether African Americans were to be included in this task with full voting rights. According to historian Eric Foner, the Gettysburg Address offered a powerful definition of the reborn nation that was to emerge from the Civil War as a land of both liberty and equality. Left unanswered was the question of how fully blacks would share in that promise in a nation where they had never known it, and whether they would finally be recognized as part of the people on whom Lincoln's concluding words declared the government rested. The location of the Gettysburg Address had its own special resonance for African Americans. Since the 18th century, the town of Gettysburg had maintained a small, vibrant African-American community, and its proximity to the Mason-Dixon line made it a hub of Underground Railroad activity. Some of the enslaved men and women who came to the region seeking freedom stayed for the prospect of employment, though most blacks worked long hours as day laborers. But during the Battle of Gettysburg, the 2 armies damaged or destroyed much of the property belonging to African Americans, and many of the black residents who fled the town did not return. Though words cannot end a war or bind up a nation's wounds, the Gettysburg Address lives on. According to historian Gary Wills, it has become an authoritative expression of the American spirit. By accepting the Gettysburg Address, its concept of a single people dedicated to a proposition, we have been changed, Because of it, we live in a different America.